Can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Awesome. Okay. If any of you have a POI, you can unmute yourself to ask the POI. My name is Sajake. I would be the Prime Minister for this round. Okay. I'm going to going to start my speech in three, two, one. Panel, ladies and gentlemen, this debate is about resources, the stake of resources in democratic societies, the stake as to how could I win elections, how could I rise to power. All this borders around the stake of resources. First, we're going to prove to you how this political dynasties within democracies arise in the first place. And when we talk about political dynasties, we're talking about the recycling of people within the same family members. Say, for example, I'm the president, my son is, my family members, my cousins are in the Senate. Um, and all those sort of things. So I have predominantly my family members within the governing power within this particular regard, and it keeps recycling within the family thing. So ultimately, the governance of those particular country are within the particular family members. An example of this can be, the Scotland, for example, where the royal family are still within the parliamentarian of the state. An example is still within Kenya, for example, where we have the Kenyatta family governing all this sort of thing. An example is Saudi Arabia, for example, where the royal family are still the one governing the huge like policy laws. So it's the extent to which family members keep recycling this sort of thing. And how did they rise into prominence? They rise into prominence in two ways. First, they use their resources in the independence of the states, and that's why in the vast majority of instances the state is named after them, like the Saudi Arabia is named after the Saud, for example. Kenya is named after the Kenyatta family, for
Why?
example. Their resources was very integral to the founding of the states, and that's how they rise into prominence in the political leadership of this particular state, and they keep recycling themselves. Secondly, because they also fund certain political parties that rose to prominence, for example, looking at the Anglo families in Angola, for example, that funds the MPLA party that rose into power and has dominance up until now. It means that the level of how they fund this level of hegemony is what exists. I'm going to take that clarification before I proceed.
Note the
All right.
motion speaks specifically about democratic politics. So things such as kings or countries like Kenya and Angola that have had massive democratic backsliding don't really fall within what opposition has to defend.
No, no, they do fall under what you need to defend because we think Scotland, even if it had a royalty that's still infused into political dynasty, Scotland is still a democracy, for example. The UK, for example, most of the UK royal family members are still within the parliamentarian sitting, for example, and they keep recycling themselves. And I give you an example of Kenya, for example. The Kenyatta families keep recycling themselves within the political dynasty realm of the country, and that also fall within the kind of democratic states that you want. So even if I use the example of Saudi Arabia, it's just an example to explain to you the extent of resources that leadership can have in the trickling down of certain democracies that can exist. That's just an example. If you're going to engage in example, you're going to lose. What then can be the likely counterfactual, and why I'm going to show you reasons why we support that counterfactual, and that's what amounts to why we regret the existence of this particular thing, because its existence isn't allowing the counterfactual to happen. The counterfactual can be in two folds. First, where there are no political dynasties, where they use their resources to fund political parties, but they are not recycling themselves in power. This look like, for example, the families of the Elons in the U.S. funding a lot of politicians within the U.S. who aligns with their ideology. This is different from the Elons family trying to recycle themselves in power or them being in power in themselves. This
Yeah,
look like the
why?
Bill Gates in the U.S. funding political parties, but not that the Bill Gates in themselves are in themselves in the political parties. I'm going to explain why this counterfactual is very important and why it's likely for it to happen. But before I proceed, what's that POI?
How on earth is it any better for someone to be making like backdoor dealings from the back and busy controlling politics
Yes,
with money
yes,
rather than putting
yes.
themselves
Good.
forward for the people to decide?
Good. I'm going to explain why that counterfactual is more better than in a world where they proliferate themselves in politics. The very first reason why we regret this is because it limits the lobbying power of citizens. And the lobbying power of citizens in a democracy are very much important because the lobbying power of any citizens fits into the root of choice, the root of representation. It fits into the extent of unionism, the extent to which you could have pressure groups that pressure the government to make certain policies. Let me weigh it on a comparative and show you why the regret is more justified. The first is in the instance where these particular people are in power. They do not need to lobby the ordinary citizens for them to be able to pass certain things. So, for example, the Kenyatta family in Kenya do not need to lobby governments to award a lot of contracts to their family members because the extent to which you need to lobby power structures to favor you is absent because they are the power structure. This also means that the extent to which you interact with them is so much powerful because of the power symmetry that exists. They don't have to care about you to be able to achieve their ends because if they could move policies,
You're all right.
brothers is their brother is the Senate president. Counterfactual is better in two ways. First, if you're in the background, you're not in the direct flow of affairs. Meaning, even if you have resources, your resources will be tailored in two ways. Even if you directly fund a particular political party, this means two things. First, the extent to which those particular people, you can't fund everyone within these particular political parties because you're not in the aim of affairs. Meaning that even if you fund a sect of that political parties and then they go rogue, there is another sect that could check them. For example,
You're
if
all
the
right.
Elon Musk parties, I'm protected time. If Elon Musk fund the rightist politicians, even if they go rogue in the representation of Elon Musk's idea, there is also another wing that can counterbalance that particular arrangement within the political scenario of that particular country. It is worse off in the world where political dynasties exist because in that there are no check and balance mechanisms that can exist in the extent to which people can lobby. But then secondly, it's that they then need to lobby ordinary citizens for their policies to pass because you're no longer in the aim of affairs. You can't just pass policies because you hold power. Now you don't have power, you have resources to be able to lobby. I think it's better because the extent to which you could hold certain people accountable, but then secondly, it means you could check certain excesses that can exist within the existence of these things. I'm very proud to oppose.
Cool. We thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Please ensure that you are keeping track of time on your side just to ensure that you are POIing at the correct times. But without further ado, we'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Is it fine for everyone's Wi-Fi if I turn my camera on, or would you rather have it off?
Doesn't look like there are any objections, so it's all good.
Cool. Give me 2 seconds to arrange my notes and I'll start shortly. Cool. Before I begin, POIs in the chat, please. Let's just deal with a counterfactual because it is a massive losing mistake for the government bench, and notably co-losing government has to defend the same counterfactual as well. Otherwise, it would be a knife. They would rather have politicians funded from like dark corners and backside rooms and use their money to amass control rather than people running directly for office. Why is this problematic? 3 reasons. One, we think that it changes the incentives of these political dynasties. At least in the status quo, when there are political dynasties, they still need to compete for votes in the first place, meaning the way that they make their policies politics and they make their decisions is likely based off of the interest of people. Comparatively, when it's just about funding, they don't need to cater towards the democratic will of people, but rather they can just see how much a certain politician is willing to get bought off. Secondly, we think that it's worse for citizen power because citizens, when people are making deals in back rooms and dark corners, you're able to get a lot less knowledge. This is getting a lot less projected on like news screens. These people don't have to do news conferences and don't have to publish policy reports and what they stand for. So citizens have a lot less knowledge, so they make a lot less of informed votes. Thirdly, note how they describe the mass control of these dynasties. They say that these people ruin politics and they make it impossible for people to make good decisions. This likely means that these dynasties have a lot of wealth and have a lot of control. Why is this more problematic when they are not acting as politicians or running directly for seats? Because this means that they still can, because this means that all the harms about persuasion or being able to control like the police, etc., still exist on their side because they can literally just fund a politician to do their same bidding on their side. But the comparative is that they get even less backlash from society because less people know about them and less people know about their like what they're doing in politics. And a clear example of this is more people know about what the Clintons do in politics than what people know about like Bill Gates. Cool. On setup then, note we don't have to defend things like kings, noblemen like Scotland, or like massive countries that have democratic backsliding. This motion specifically states that we only have to defend political dynasties and democratic politics. We don't think that these things constitute as democratic politics as they are inherently undemocratic. So this debate needs to be about, is this good for not like democracy and how people make certain votes? A few examples of this could look like the Kennedys, the Clintons, or even like we'll bite the bullet and say like the Lee Kuan Yew family in Singapore. This prominence has often been democratic in the first place. So it looks like when Hillary Clinton ran for power after Bill Clinton, she still won the popular votes of people. Even though she has a lot of backing in the first place, she still is able to win votes and convince people. She is someone who is good to win power for. Let's just then note where the delta is in this debate and where change is happening. It's likely happening for people who are not that politically informed, because politically active people likely don't care if you have the same surname as someone else because they're still going to do their research and they're still going to care. So these people are not where the change is happening. The change is specifically happening where people who don't do research and likely just rely on names or sloganism or different forms of populism. What is the counterfactual that we think is likely and is the correct one that needs to be defended in the debate? It's likely one where people then switch from depending on political dynasties as their main source of where they vote for to things such as party loyalty. The reason for this is that people who blindly vote likely want to vote on people that they don't need to do that much research on or they don't want to have that much more assurance. I'm going to prove to you why party loyalty is something that's a lot worse than political dynasties. I'm also going to then explain, to give an argument on autonomy. Before that, what's our trade-off? We find to trade off things such as the advantages that these political dynasties have when running for office, because we just don't think it's exclusive and doesn't make that big of a change. People can still get massive advantages from things such as wealth. That's how Donald Trump won, because he's able to run a massive election campaign in 2016. People also have many connections or are part of parties that are very significant. So there are many things that make politics a lot more arbitrary. We think that political dynasties are comparatively a lot less arbitrary and are something that is a much better metric for people to blindly vote off of, because these are the people who impact the debate the most. 4 reasons why we get better politics then. 1, we think that accountability becomes a lot more centralized. We think that you're directly linked to your predecessors' politics, so we think that it kind of creates a rolling form of accountability, where you're no longer just accountable for your own politics in particular, but you need to be accountable for previous people's decisions. This likely means that people think a lot more long-term and are unlikely to make, rash decisions because they know it's going to affect their political dynasty down the line in the first place. But C, we think that it creates an expectation and a legacy. So this flips any claim that's going to come out about accountability, because when people expect that you act like, Kennedy and JF Kennedy, when RFK Jr. is doing a whole bunch of crazy things in the US Health Department, he gets a lot more backlash because this is something that is seen as so unusual and something that is so bad. So people seen as a laughingstock and is seen as a disgrace to his family. In the chat, please. Secondly, we get more long-term politics. The structural reason for this is political dynasties have to care a lot more about things such as ensuring that their dynasty still stays in power. They're often close-knit families, so they don't want to upset it for their future generations or upset the other family members who are also in politics at the same time. So you have a lot more people holding each other accountable. This is a lot better than things such as party politics, because party politics, you can often backstab someone in your party and still be in power because you're a lot less close to them, so it's going to have a lot less of, like a personal harm to you, in the first place. But B, we also just think that party politics, it's quite easy to replace someone and to try and defeat it. We think that historically it's looked like how the Republican Party has been massively rebranded under MAGA, where something like the RFKs, they've been very consistent throughout their entire times until you get like one anomaly about RFK, and even in that instance, the party, the political dynasty holds him accountable. Where if you look at the Republican Party, they don't hold Trump accountable because they still always try to boost the party's image rather than preserve a certain legacy or understanding of this like the certain party. Before I go on, I'll take that POI from CG.
Note Marcos Bongbong in the Philippines is somebody who has now been attacked with character from his sister because she cannot attack the policies because they are part of the same legacy. Or you have a people not attacking policy, but just the legacy.
Philippines is not a democratic state. They're inherently undemocratic and they weaponize their military against citizens. That's not in the debate. Thirdly, we get a lot less polarized politics because when you're already known in the political environment, you don't need to compete for airtime as much. You already have an established fan base, so you're less likely to do radical or strange things to get mass attention in the first place. So we don't think that people are doing things to polarize as much. The way for this is quite simple. We think that we have politicians that are like creating a lot less harm onto individuals, and we have politicians that are a lot less violent, and politics that's a lot more friendly, but politics that holds politicians a lot more accountable. Lastly, then, on voter autonomy. Given all these reasons about why political dynasties are a lot more consistent in their politics than something like a political party, we think it's better for a blind voter to base their vote off of something like a political dynasty than a party. Parties change their politics all the time because they're trying to rebrand to get to the next electoral cycle, where political dynasties likely think much more long-term, 50 years down the line, because they're trying to think what their grandchildren are going to be a part of this, or their other like cousins who are also in like the politics and how they are going to be affected by this. So we think that they often have a more consistent message. So being able to just blindly vote off of your perception of them is likely going to result in a result that you know a lot more about, and is going to lead to people making more informed decisions. This is good because we think that the only way that democracy matters and we can ensure that democracy is good is when people are making decisions that are in their best interest and people have the knowledge to know what's in their best interest. Side OO.
All right, we thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech. We now like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case. Here.
Have I been called already?
Yes.
Okay, all right, sure. Okay. Just get to my time. I did not start right away. All right, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. John F. Kennedy is possibly one of the best presidents America has ever had. But he did some shady stuff which still affect the US to date, typically among which was he being one of the first proponents of the Vietnam War, which turned out to be possibly the worst intervention of the US as far as international policy is concerned. The reason that topics never come to light is because there are a lot of Kennedys in the US Congress already who have an incentive to protect and cement the legacy of their godfather, and as such will oppose any attempt to unearth these harms. I think we are not radical from OG to say that dynasties are typically evil in all forms. We are taking the quite moderate stance to say that even if dynasties in existence are good, their operation, especially their meddling in political affairs, can be harmful in many instances, and that's why we oppose it. There are two fundamental things you get from opening opposition. First, they say that dynasties are important to centralize accountability. The extent of that argument is for them to see that for people who are coming to power already have a structure that they are building on, right? So that means they are most likely going to extend on policies that already are in existence. I think if this is true, it is also true that they are less likely to hold corrupt politicians accountable insofar as those politicians are their brothers or their cousins or people within their political dynasties. You know why? Because you possibly came into power as a congressman or as a president or something else because you came from a particular political dynasty, be it the Bush family, be it the Kennedy family, or any other family we can talk about. So that means you owe some form of your legitimacy to that dynasty, and that means you are less likely to antagonize any flaws within the system that you are a beneficiary of. But secondly, they say that people who come from the root of dynasties are most likely going to be moderate and not radical because, paraphrasing, they have little to prove to the public. Most likely, intuitively, they are implying that those who are radical in politics are those who have everything to prove to people in order for them to buy legitimacy. Let's break this down in two ways. Firstly, I think that likely also means that people are most likely going to be less susceptible to using radicalness if radicalness is a means by which we oppose any oppressive systems. There are some instances where people need to be radical. For instance, if you are fighting against oppression of Black people in the US, you need to be radical. If you are fighting for women's rights in typically patriarchal systems, say in Saudi Arabia, you need to be radical. I think we oppose a world where people are afraid of taking the hard stance because they think that those hard stances possibly are going to backfire on them, or because they already feel entitled to political power in that instance. There are two extensions you're going to get from me. But firstly, let's be clear. I think our counterfactual has been misrepresented by open opposition. I think we oppose any form of dynasties, even if it's good or bad, because those dynasties to some extent gatekeep opportunities and to some extent hegemonize power, which can be used to oppress people who don't belong to those dynasties. So any world where dynasties don't exist is typically a war. When open opposition started by Keyes by saying that dynasties can still exist insofar as those wealthy families can continue funding political parties if they're not directly contesting for political office. I think that is unfair to the debate because insofar as those wealthy families are in any way funding a political party, they're still meddling in democratic policy. That means it is still our world. I don't think that is the counterfactual Ajake gave you in his speech. First extension for my speech is on the idea that we regret dynasties because they are anti-democratic, anti-establishment systems. I'm going to prove this in three ways. Firstly, is that dynasties by establishment restrict access to opportunities and political spaces because by definition, it's a hereditary rule. If you don't belong to the Bush family, most likely we're not going to have access to the opportunities that are restricted to their family members. But two is that dynasties mostly hegemonize political power, and they do so by actively recruiting people into political spaces, so much so that at any point in time in the US Congress, there's a Kennedy, there's a Bush in the families in the Congress. Thirdly, is that dynasties privatize democracy. You know why? Because they make democratically available opportunities a private affair. I don't think they possibly directly antagonize people from actively aspiring for political offices, but they obviously use their social power to silence opposition and give a disproportionate advantage to people who are a root of that particular dynasty. Why is this bad? It's bad for three reasons. Yes, you.
Chris, why is all these things you're saying true in democratic policies, in politics?
I think it's a regret motion. These are literally harms I'm pointing out to you from status quo. Why this is bad is a couple of reasons. One is that in opposition to what open opposition says, there has been less accountability because any attempt to hold people who possibly were corrupt or possibly broke the law in the past is a direct attempt to break down the very dynasty that you are a beneficiary of. I gave you the JF Kennedy example. There are a lot of examples with the Bush family in this regard. But secondly, is that the idea of gatekeeping opportunities is just very oppressive to people, especially within the minority class who don't have the privilege of coming from a wealthy or well-to-do family. But thirdly, it breeds incompetence, right? Because in the desperate attempt to preserve the legacy and protect the dynasty, a lot of very incompetent people, typically Trump, for instance, has been pushed into political spaces or in an attempt to continue to keep the dynasty going in that regard. But the second part of this argument is to say that dynasties most of the times are very oppressive. They are oppressive in two ways. One is that they can't directly use state power to silence minorities. Typical examples happen especially with the Bush family. Secondly, they could be indirect in the use of violence, where that indirect use of violence could be hiding under certain groups to use oppressive powers against people. Even if they have any benefit that open oppositions are to, within that, this anti-democratic nature of these political dynasties means that there's something we are proud to regret from opening government.
All right. We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We now call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close off the opening half of the debate. Here.
Cool. I'm just taking my time and organizing my notes. Cool. Just to check, am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you're audible.
And is it fine if I turn on my camera? Gonna take that as a yes. Cool. With that being said, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The logical extension of OG's case and the POI we get from CG is not that they're against political dynasties, they're just against loyalty to specific ideologies and not calling out those ideologies. But guess what? Something like your bloodline doesn't determine whether you're loyal to an ideology. That just comes down to your belief systems. And that's something that's not exclusive to political dynasties, that exists outside of political dynasties. People still have party loyalty on their side. People still don't criticize their predecessors in their world, even if they're related to them or not, because at the end of the day, they don't want to detach themselves from like MAGA. So for example, JD Vance running for president in 2028, he's obviously not going to criticize Trump, even though they're not related, even though that's not a political dynasty. They still have party loyalty. That's the issue that their side is actually against. And ironically, that's also their counterfactual. They kind of knife themselves, and CG's POI about bongo markers in the Philippines is also counterintuitive. Strategically, I'm going to be dealing with two things. Then I'll give you two clashes. Firstly, on better governance, and secondly, on which side just upholds democracy better principally. On strategy, the first thing I want to note is that political dynasties are still subject to democratic laws and the constitution. So OG paints political dynasties as like these oppressive monarchies, like the Bush family supposedly having an overexerted amount of power. But at the end of the day, the Bush family is still beholden to things like the Supreme Court. They can't just start randomly oppressing people, otherwise they'll be impeached, otherwise they'll get kicked out of office. At the end of the day, this is a debate about democracies. We aren't talking about theocracies like Saudi Arabia. And notably, we call out OG out for this in a POI, and they're like, oh no, but Scotland and the UK also have monarchies. But understand, those are constitutional monarchies who have no power over policy or like the implementation of politics. So those are just irrelevant to the debate. All of the examples they literally give us of like centralization of power and monopolization are not examples of democracies. Those are examples of monarchies and theocracies. But secondly, I just want to deal with OG's counterfactual, because their harm with political dynasties is the recycling of politicians and subsequently the recycling of ideas. Notably, they don't explain why the recycling of ideas is a bad thing, because sometimes you have progressive politicians who are part of the same dynasty who bring progressive ideas. But nonetheless, I'll be charitable and assume the most extreme case, because OG's case is just extreme inherently. I want to note recycling politicians is not unique, because in their world, you still have party loyalty where politicians with the same stagnant ideologies get recycled. And like I said in my introduction, JD Vance is going to be the Republican nominee in 2028, but he's just a recycled version of Donald Trump, even though neither of them are related or a part of a political dynasty. Their world still has recycling of power and recycling of politicians, just through other avenues, i.e. through ideology, i.e. through parties, i.e. through wealth. It's just not filial, it's just not like through your dynasty. But at the end of the day, the harm isn't mutually exclusive. Therefore, OG and CG's case can't stand unless they prove that this is unique to dynasties. On the first clash then of better governance, notably, they don't respond to what Daniel tells you in his speech. We told you two things. We told you two things as to why we get better governance. First of all, we get more centralized accountability because when you're related to the previous politician, people already have a preconceived expectation of what you're supposed to be like. But secondly, and very crucially, political dynasties allow for long-termist policies within democracies because it's important to understand oftentimes long-term policies don't get implemented in democracies because electoral cycles are very short, i.e. they only last 4 or 5 years, which means things like 18-year education programs never get passed. The unique benefit with political dynasties is that you can implement long-term policies because even after your 4-year cycle ends, your family member can now come in power and continue with that policy. So you have things like long-term healthcare and education policies being passed in our world. In their world with separate parties, it's more spontaneous and more random, and therefore you're probably not going to get long-term policies implemented. What did they say in response under this clash? The first thing they give us with very little analysis is essentially that their side gets greater accountability, and the reason they give us because supposedly political dynasties have less checks and balances. Two responses. First of all, OG's entire case assumes that political dynasties always win the election, but that's not always true. Hillary Clinton still lost to Trump even though she was related to Bill Clinton, which proves that at the end of the day, political dynasties are still subject to democracy. They still have to win the popular vote, and if they don't, they won't get voted into power, which illustrates that they don't have a monopoly over politics.
You're right.
Game. But secondly, political dynasties, if anything, have greater checks and balances. And this is because people have greater expectations of political dynasties because they have preconceived notions of who's coming into power. And notably, this works both ways because if your predecessor was a bad politician, like the example that OG gives about JFK and his involvement in Vietnam, then you as an individual have a greater expectation to be better than that individual. But similarly, if your predecessor was a good individual, there's a greater expectation on you to also uphold those good policies. So, for example, the Roosevelts, Teddy Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, there's an expectation to continue with progressive ideals, just like her uncle did. We think that expectation only exists uniquely with political dynasties. The second thing we get from the DPM speech then is that people won't attack their predecessors in order to cement their legacy, and CG also kind of alluded to this in their silly example about the Philippines. Two responses. First of all, that's not exclusive. People from the same party also won't criticize the people who came before them. I gave you the example of how JD Vance obviously won't criticize Trump when he runs in 2028. But second of all, this is just objectively false. People oftentimes do call out their family members in order to detach themselves from the flaws of their previous family members. And the reason they have an incentive to do this is because they want to uphold their family's legacy and make their family's legacy seem moral and seem like a good political dynasty. And therefore, the only way to make your dynasty seem positive is to detach yourself from the flaws of your predecessors and to ensure that you call that out and make sure that you're going to be the better version of that previous individual. So think about the fact that when Hillary Clinton ran in 2016, she often criticized the things that Bill Clinton did and made it clear that she was going to be better than Bill Clinton and she was going to be the better version of him. So on the way up, I think it's quite clear we win on better governance because it's the only side that firstly gets the unique benefit of long-termist policies, but more crucially, we get centralized accountability because of the preconceived notions that people have when it comes to political dynasties. Before my second clash on principle, I'll take that POI from OG.
Out of order.
Oh, okay, cool. On principle, notably, the only thing they really tell us here is that we political dynasties restrict access because of hereditary rule. First of all, this is not exclusive. People still gatekeep each other based on ideology and based on party loyalty, i.e., the Republicans obviously aren't going to hire Democrats. That's still gatekeeping based on ideology. This goes back to my intro where I showed you that OG's issue with their case isn't actually political dynasties. It's just stagnation of ideas. Comparatively, Daniel's principle was far more impactful. We get greater voter autonomy because voters have a better understanding of who's coming into power. Information is crucial for autonomous votes, and our side is the only side that gets autonomous votes because political dynasties all allow you to have an understanding of the next person that's coming into power. Vote OO.
Alrighty, we thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech, and that brings a close to the opening half of this debate. We now call upon the Member of Government to open the closing half. Here.
Okay, cool. Am I audible and am I visible?
Yes to both.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to be beginning then in 3, Oh, sorry, let's get my timer out. 3, 2, 1. The reason states are undemocratic, as OO likes to frame, because they are democratically backsliding, is because these individuals, these political dynasties, have been put in place. If these dynasties were not there, if they were not put in power, a lot of these would have better democracies than they did now. I'm going to be giving you 2 unique extensions in my speech. Firstly, why this is likely to limit political engagement in terms of things like discouraging others from running and encouraging voter apathy. And secondly, why it's likely to worsen policy implementation because of a discouraging change, the resources being used ineffectively, and internal feuds becoming problematic. Before that, though, one quick thing I need to clarify, because the counterfactual isn't really clear. I think it's important to note, under our world, what's likely to happen is twofold. One, actual policy change at the start of these democracies. This looks like having policies that state that one family cannot be in power for more than like 2 or 3 terms in like presidential power or power in terms of like electoral power. But I think secondly, what's important though is probably also going to be a cultural and shifts amongst the people. So people are likely to also view this as a bad thing when one group of people entrenches power, and that's how this changes. Otherwise, there will unlikely to ever be a lack of prominence within politics towards things like single parties constantly being in power. If there's direct apathy for one person being in power and one group, it's likely to also translate to things like single parties. Secondly, 2 responses I want to make before I move on to the overall case that we bring, because most of my responses are integrated. 1, they try to frame that political backsliding cannot be part of this debate. I'm going to be clear in my argumentation why it is. But even if that wasn't the case, it's just a really unfair burden to place on us. Because even the examples they want to use of places like America are rife with political backsliding in terms of things like actively, like Trump's advocating towards things like shifting away from democracy in that case. So I think in most states, there's like back deals and shady back deals happening. We're unclear why this is clear for in this case. Secondly, they try to frame that like party legacies are much worse. I think this is one strategically weird for them because their case swaps between using this as a response to the government case and then using multipolar, multi-party systems to build up their case. Like their case only works when there are multiple parties in power, and that being a better system to exist with. But secondly, note the scale of buy-in, this length of buy-in is just largely different. Because when you're somebody who is just related by party, you're just related by ideals. So people can vote separately. When you are voted and you're raised by blood, you were raised by the same people who pulled you out of poverty and the same people who pulled you out of oppression. You are likely to vote for them in the instance where you feel as if they are the same in that same instance. So I think a lot of these things are problematic things pushes by OO. The final thing they told us is that these would rather use backdoor dealings, and that's going to be problematic because they're just going to lobby new politicians. What's really important to understand here is at the very least, new politicians have to cater towards what the people want, because otherwise they will have no power. So sure, I think every system has political as weird backdoor deals that happens, but I think the difference is new people don't have to actively listen towards what the people want because they have less like buy-in from the past. On to the first argument then, specifically around why it limits political engagement. 2 layers here. First, it discourages other people from running. And notice it's uniquely separate from what OG came, because OG really didn't give us any mechanistic analysis here, but also they were unable to talk about the specific funding levels and funding mechanisms of this. So what? The image is needed to succeed. So they run on the image that exists, which means most people are unable to like fight that level of image and fight the image that comes from this person being like the grandchild of like of your freedom fighter. But secondly, they're also just outfunded. Most of the time, these political dynasties have mass amounts of money because they were able to entrench those funds in the first place. In that case, it just discourages a lot of other people from being able to existing and running in this case. Why is this really bad then? This is worse under their world because now these are people and these are politicians that are framed as people on the ground. Like your grandfather was somebody who was growing up with us, so you must also be somebody who was a person on the ground there for the people. But you grew up in wealth and you grew up surrounded by separate ideals where you knew you would be in power, which is why this largely happens also in the global south and is effective in the global south, because that is where a lot of the times these pushes against power have existed. But secondly, you'll just encourage a heightened level of apathy, which is important because now people are unlikely to want to vote for anyone else because they don't think that anyone else will win. Once you have this family in power for multiple cycles, it's likely to lead to cycles of people not even attempting to vote for other individuals, which leads to levels of accountability that cannot be shifted. What does that mean? 1, this likely leads to the democratic backsliding that Daniel and Amir wanted to talk about. Because in the instance where you are unable to have any shifts away from these people, you are obviously going to lead into poor democratic cycles. I think in the instance where these were largely more multipolar or multi-party, we think it was largely to be better in that instance. Even if it's single party, we have things like in South Africa where the GNU is now being formed because people had large apathy against the ANC. In the Philippines,
On
a
that,
democratic state, don't let them lie to you. The Philippines is a place which has had power consistently. In Kenya, like Kenyatta was voted in legitimately, except now he isn't legitimate because he was able to undermine the people. The second argument then is about why it's going to worsen policy implementation. Before that, I'll take a POI from opening.
none of your problems are exclusive to dynasties. Your case bludgeons democracy when you ban people from running. Let people have a choice.
Wow, so they're trying to make up a new case now that we destroyed their previous case. Very note that's weird. But secondly, I think what's really important to understand here is that you're not banning, even if we were to ban individuals from running, these are individuals who we would rather have out of it. We ban many people from running for many instances. Look at things like how we ban things like criminals. We think this is okay in that instance there. Secondly, we worsen policy implementation. 3 layers here. 1, you discourage any change from happening. Because firstly, they don't want to destroy the legacy that has existed. You are unable to go against what the people in your family previously did, because that is going against the things you ran on in the first place. But secondly, also just likely to have similar ideals. You are raised among similar ideals in that case. Note this response to all of their points about better policies, because if the discussion is about expectation and legacy and that being good, we think that's actively false and it's worse for these individuals in the instance where you have no evolution of politics and you have no evolution of policies. Secondly, note the resources that are likely to be used at the start of political dynasties are likely to be used to entrench power of that dynasty. When they have the possibility of their family staying in power for years to come, you are likely to push most of the resources to entrenching that power. This looks like things like what the Kenyatta family did with offshore bank accounts to be able to make sure that the people in the future are able to have money and able to have the ability to run for power. In that instance, then you're not using the resources to help build up a nation that needs them. You're not using resources to help build up the people when they need them. You're not going to get better healthcare. You're getting more money into their bank accounts. But thirdly, notice actually internal feuds that exist. That's what I talked about with my example of what's happening in the Philippines. When Marcos Bongbong's like sister talks about him having cocaine issues, that then becomes national problems instead of just having discussions around things like policies that exist. We think it becomes more so ad hominem attacks on individuals. You worsen political engagement, you worsen policy implementation. OO's case is a dream of democracy that never exists.
All right, we thank the member of government for that speech. We now call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Okay. Just to confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible and visible.
Okay. I think, yeah, so I didn't get a chance to write a lot of things down. So if I just bear with me there. Okay, cool. Let me enable my camera. All right, cool. So, let's see if I can get a timer on. Yeah, let me see if I can get my timer on. Clock. Sorry, just I'm trying to get the timer. Okay, so I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think most of the case that we get from the opening half has been very, very weird in the sense that most of the argumentations don't have exclusivity. A lot of them are just examples that don't have analysis at all. The first claim we get from opposition is the idea to say, no, this thing restricts access to democracy and how people have that ability to continue from power. I think the biggest assumption that opening government has been able to make, or that all the government teams, that having a dynasty is an inherent advantage. We don't think the data or statistics prove that. We gave you the example of Hillary Clinton, how even though her husband was a former president, she lost the Democratic nomination to Obama, and when she eventually did, was an outsider politically, and when she eventually did won the Democratic nomination, she lost to Trump. We tell you the example of Jeb Bush, who never got a chance to win the Democratic nomination. We'd give you the example also of George W. Bush, who the father was a one-term president, meaning the father lost the second term, meaning by the time he ended his term in office was not a popular president, and George Bush also wasn't a popular president either. We give you another example of Nkosazana Zuma, who lost the ANC nomination to Cyril Ramaphosa when he was Sierra 17 bid when she was contesting against him for the presidency. We think the idea that this whole thing, having a family member was in politics, is always inherent advantage is the assumption that we are rejecting from closing up opposition. We don't think it's always an advantage. We think in some instances it may be an inherent disadvantage. We think they don't meet the burden of proving how in all instances this thing is always an advantage, that it makes you so grotesque in essence. But secondly, they don't even give us the analysis as to how come they think they bypass all those processes. We think it's very easy to claim that just because you're a family member, things will be easier for you. There is no inherent analysis to show you which part of democracy means or what part of politics, what exactly is the advantage of having someone who was a former president. In fact, you may even have the disadvantage of getting information that may not be relevant at the point in time. We all know how parents try to superimpose their beliefs and systems, and they may try to superimpose beliefs and systems that may not apply to a context that you're being raised in at a particular time and particular moment. So we don't necessarily agree to this overarching assumption. We don't think they do enough burden of proof to show us why inherently it's always an advantage. Our first extension that it's not always an advantage to have a family while in politics can sometimes be a hindrance.
Why?
There's no burden from Gav to show what it is. Secondly, that I'll just do in terms of response is they say that what else do we get from closing government? They say they talk about issues of funding and money. We think they don't understand the nature of politics. We think politics necessarily is characterized by things like that. We think blood is as an arbitrary factor as charisma is as an arbitrary factor as being a child of a billionaire like Trump was. We think even if you remove people who have the political capital of former politicians, which is not always the case, we think you still get individuals like Trump who have the capital or the resource of being a child of a person who was wealthy and inherited wealth. We think then at what point then do we stop the matches of regret? Because individuals do have a lot of arbitrary traits. We think that's fundamentally bad. We think ultimately a lot of the government case they don't show what any counterfactual is. No. We don't show why any counterfactual is better. But let's move on to more further extension argumentations. We think regretting dynasties, and especially the narrative around regretting it, pushes people towards and voters towards worse alternatives. We think individuals, when you regret something, you create a backlash logic. And when societies stigmatize dynasties, voters don't suddenly choose people who are better. They always tend to political strongmen and anti-system outsiders. The biggest example of this is how the rise of Donald Trump existed, because his main push was fueled about how Clinton is a representation of the system and how he's offering something new. When you then regret this particular prominent, you often make people tend to go towards the further extreme, which is fundamentally worse. So regretting this creates a culture that makes people leave the establishment, which in most instances has a certain rule that establishment embellishes and allows and exposes people to something that is fundamentally and could potentially be more worse. We think that's fundamentally bad. But more importantly, we think how then does this also unlock opportunities for minorities to enter politics and occupy spaces because of family names? No, please stop badgering. And stop allows people to enter politics in spaces that they otherwise would not have entered. Two analysis for this. We think at a point in time where, as a minority, look, for example, how Michelle Obama is constantly being mentioned as a push, as a person who can be at the top of the Democratic ticket. Why? Because a family name can give you an opportunity to bypass barriers that as a minority you otherwise would not have been able to do so. Meaning that, for example, let's say if you're a black person or a gay person, but you're a son of someone who's prominent, you are more likely to occupy this position of power than the alternatives. We think it is an avenue and an opportunity for individuals who otherwise do not have access to levels of power to sort of like have instances whereby they're able to sort of access these halls of power. I'll take the POI from the person who was asking POI in this. Yep.
The logic of your case is weird, because the only reason Trump could frame and become more extreme was because of the political dynasty of the Clintons.
Yeah, so no. The reason why he was able to do so, because he was able to galvanize the narrative that you are pushing, which is that of regret. Because the idea and the convincing to say people, no, we ought to regret this, is what allowed him to weaponize. So the process of regretting that narrative is what allowed Trump to recognize. It's not the existence of the dynasty. Because also understand that the existence of the dynasty also existed when he appointed RFK. But because Democrats did not frame RFK's appointment as dynasties, but Trump did frame it as a regret. So the issue is not about the dynasty itself; it's about how you frame the dynasty and how you choose to mechanize it, which is what Trump did. We think that's why the regret, particularly, is fundamentally bad. Note we're the only team that shows you how the regretting process, in and within itself, causes as inherent harm, not just the existence, but also. Why then do we think our extension is the most relevant extension? For a few reasons. We're the only team that calls out to say a lot of the alternatives are far much more worse, in as far as you consider the fact that individuals in the alternatives still rely on things like money, still rely on things like charisma, things rely on things that are very arbitrary as bloodline. We don't see why you inherently regret bloodline when a lot of other things favoritism, cronyism still are as prominent. We don't think that's fundamentally true. We're also the only team that rejects the narrative that having a family member who was in politics is always an inherent advantage. We think there's so many other things that there are a lot of double-edged sword that comes with that and a lot of baggage that you need to defend that are not your own that undermines democracy. We tell you also how instances of how minorities or individuals who otherwise would not have been able to gain access to political powers, like women, like gays, like Hispanics and all those things, and in the LGBTQ community are more likely to do so at the point in time where they can be propped up by political dynasty. We think you don't get those alternatives in your world. They needed to prove exclusivity on their world. We think we'll hardly get any case of exclusive. We don't see how the counterfactual is any better. Cool. Thanks. Bye.
All right, we thank the member of opposition for that speech. We'd now like to call upon the government board to close off the government team's case. Here.
Okay, Fumane is joining the Zoom now because of the connection issues. So it should be on like a minute. Give us 1 sec. Let's join this.
No stress.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, just checking, am I audible?
Yep, you are audible.
Okay, perfect. Okay, cool. I'll start in 3, 2, wait, I'm so sorry, let me get my time up. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I think the biggest issue that's existed in today's debate is both houses on both sides of the house trying to run the idea that your harm is mutually exclusive and our harm is mutually exclusive. And it's been a very problematic chat, specifically starting from OO, right? OO has many, many logic gaps because they want to try and argue that any harms that exist in political dynasties also exist in other instances where there's party loyalty, right? So then they tell us, right? Firstly, they tell us there's going to be more holistic accountability because now you have to defend what your family does, right? Why is this not likely? The problem is when you try and say that, hey, JD Vance being loyal to Trump is equal to you being loyal to your uncle, that's where you missed the chat, right? Because JD Vance is loyal to the Republican Party. That means if the Republicans wake up tomorrow and decide, hey, maybe we want to keep immigrants in America, JD Vance is likely going to change that narrative as well because he wants to be voted into power. This is different when you want to be loyal to your family, because what happens is you actually have someone in your house every day telling you these are the policies that exist in our family, these are the things that we ought to defend. You're not going to go up there and say, hey, I'm just going to talk badly on my forefathers, because not only are they the people or the reason that you are existing in power, but they're also just your family members, right? It's not the same thing. Party loyalty and family loyalty are different. This is the exact distinction that we ought to argue, right? So accountability isn't best on your side, because what's likely going to happen and what has happened, note this is a retrospective motion, that your family is going to buy you out of trouble, right? Because they want to keep that legacy up, because they want to keep the power. Means if you make a mistake, your family is just going to throw money at the problem and make it better so that you can stay in power, and that your niece and nephew coming after you can stay in power after you, right? Which means accountability is worth in political dynasties because of the fact that it is a family and not a party, right? JD Vance and Trump aren't loyal to each other. They're only sticking together because they're loyal to the Republican Party. This is the distinction. And the last point they give us is about that there's going to be more long-term policy. I think this is inherently problematic, because if you are going to be a political person, you have to think long-term either way, right? Because in order for you to be a good president, you have to think about policies that are inherently long-term. That's the logic gap that exists on OO. If your point is that there's going to be better long-term policies because you know that your niece and nephew is coming after you, that means then that point is contingent on there being loyalty, right? Which means if you concede to the fact that without dynasties, there still is political loyalty. There still are people voting ANC every year, no matter what. That means then the existence of long-term policies can exist on our side too, because that it is contingent on loyalty, and you concede that loyalty isn't exclusive to dynasties, means that your point isn't exclusive to dynasties. You aren't actually defending dynasties. But why then are long-term policies why then are long-term policies better in terms of party loyalty? They're better because you want to stay in power, right? They're better because you actually have opposition. You actually existing in a democracy that puts pressure on you, right? Which means if you create long-term policies, you better your legacy. There are no Smani Bashani in the term of 2026 created this education policy that has lasted for many, many years. You still have an inherent likelihood and mandate to want to create long-term policies. It's not exclusive on their side. CO gives us something very weird. So CO wants to take this retrospective motion and say that it's going to create prospective issues if we regret it, right? By the fact that they say we're going to stigmatize dynasties and people are just going to now not vote for the right person because they don't exist in a dynasty. That's just wrong, right? What is the logic of trying to argue that case? Because if we say that we want to ban dynasties, if we say that we regret dynasties, it's because we've seen the impact of those dynasties, right? What Emmett tries to do is say that dynasties is just another characteristic that you can use to vote you in, right? He says it's the same thing as having money, as having more power. It's not, because the with dynasties is that there's an inherent entrenchment of power. Note, this only comes from CG when Russell tells you about how the money that exists in dynasties is inherently a bad thing, right? Dynasties isn't just an inherent characteristic that people have for them to be voted in, because it exists in your family. It exists in you entrenching power. It exists in you being inherently undemocratic, right? That means we are regretting them because of the fact that it isn't just another characteristic, right? It isn't just another thing that people can say, hey, you exist in a dynasty, and therefore this is good for me to vote you in, right? Because he gives us examples of George Bush and Hillary Clinton. We think these are like uncharitable examples. We have to consider dynasties, meaning people who have been in power for a long time, right? That is the very definition of a dynasty. We're talking about people that exist in the global south, like, which is very important what Russell says, right? Go.
Yeah, Fumani, note that in politics right now, there are no dynasties that exist for a long time because naturally they always get voted out and they always die. So which example are you talking about of a long dynasty? That's more than 3 generations.
You didn't listen to Russell's speech when Russell gave you the example of the Philippines, right? The Philippines has this exact problem, and it has happened in the past as well, right? I don't know why you want me to argue as if this is happening right now, when we can argue retrospectively and see in the past the problem that it has created. And even now, when you were to look at countries that are, by OO's words, not democracies, we can see that the reason they aren't democracies right now, the reason this isn't happening right now, is because looking back, the political dynasties have put them in this position. Why then are we better than OG? The reasons here. Firstly, Russell explains to you about how this resources chat that exists in OC is actually a bad thing, right? We tell you that, listen, the fact that these people have money means that they put money into the country and entrench that power. Note, this isn't symmetric. OO tries to tell you that, hey, if these dynasties exist, they can just buy the police and the same thing happens. we do this, it would be illegal, right? We would rather have you do your illegal activities outside of the government so that you can actually be held accountable, so that you can actually fall into the mechanisms that exist in the state to put you into prison, right? It's not the same thing. But we also tell you then, there's going to be no opposition, right? If you're a political dynasty existing and you have money and wealth and inherent buy-in and influence, like the likelihood of there being a party that can impactfully run against you is low. This is bad because this is inherently undemocratic, right? The fact that you don't have opposition means that people are going to have more apathy, right? People are going to be more apathetic towards voting towards any sort of party that exists in opposition to you, because they know that regardless of what I do, they're not going to be voted in. But secondly, structural change doesn't happen because now the very ideas that your dad had and started teaching you when you were very young exist in your brain because this is a family legacy, right? Which means you're likely to get into power and further the ideas that your dad gave you, right? CG is the only party, is the only team in this debate that has, one, spoken towards what dynasties have done in the past and how it's created problems, but two, explain to you specifically why the existence of political dynasties, in essence of the word dynasty, is something that is harmful to democracy, harmful to democratic policies and procedures, and most of all, harmful to the people that have to exist in these democracies, especially those that are uneducated. We protect the most vulnerable, never been more proud.
All right, we thank the government whip for that speech. We now like to call upon opposition whip to close off their case as well as the debate. Here.
Right. Can I check if I'm audible?
Yes, you are audible, speaker.
It's not wasting time. It's late. All right, let me put my timer and yeah, start my speech in the first word. Chair, considering that this is a retrospective debate, I think the most important retrospective that we need to have a conversation about in this debate as we evaluate which team wins this debate is also an ideological one. To say, how does democracy even come to place in the world that we exist in? Democracy comes to place in a world that trampled over dynasties, monarchs, and all these things that existed in the past. This is to say that already inherent in democratic ideology is a hate towards anything that looks and feels like a monarch, because that's what we took down to create democratic power. Why is this particularly important? This is particularly important because it shows you the amount of gap political dynasties have to fight in a system that already inherently feels like they feel like what people stood to fight against, which means to say that in this debate, government bench fails to prove to you why there's some inherent advantage that dynasties already have, or why people already are more likely to vote for dynasties over the mere fact that they are political dynasties, and they bring that as an advantage. So let's first evaluate the team. Let's start with the team that's fourth. With OG, first problem with OG is that most of their case is particularly acontextual to the debate. Why is it acontextual to the debate? They discuss or have this conversation on political dynasties in general as they've existed in the whole of politics. Why this is particularly important is because there is a unique existence between dynasties in the global space of politics and the way they exist in democratic politics and the way individuals interact with them, or what the meaning of democratic politics is, which is clearly outlined to them in the debate. But secondly, there's a lot of mechanistic gaps in their ideas. They tell you that number one, it limits people's lobbying power, and the extent of their case is lobbying power is something that's so important, but they don't give you any mechanisms as to why political dynasties in themselves as they exist within democratic politics inherently limit lobbying power, and because of that their case significantly weak. And they even talk about accountability and why it's so important, but they don't show you why there's an inherent system within political dynasties that therefore limits their capacity to be accountable. These are the three things that they needed to prove to us and show us that within the democratic politics systems are already flawed simply because there's a political dynasty that exists. Firstly, the internal structures within democratic parties. We think that within democratic politics is a system more than it is a person, meaning to say even the parties that exist within democratic politics are based on a system. They still go through internal checks and structures. Before someone can run for any position of power, they still need to be accountable for the other systems that are built internally. Why is it by mere fact of someone being a political dynasty, which in some cases is someone who's a dynasty of a leader that was unpopular in the past, is more likely in that system to be the chosen leader? These individuals usually usually have to overcome a lot to be able to prove themselves worthy within their own internal system before they even have to advocate for themselves within the global system. But secondly, why does the democratic voting mechanism fail? Because someone is a dynasty. Why are people more likely to vote for that individual? We think that this idea is not intuitive, particularly in a system that is built on an inherent hate for something monarchy-like. We think that in and of itself doesn't prove to us why automatically, because a political dynasty exists, individuals are more likely to vote for it, or they have a favorable voter perception, so favorable that it's enough for it to be regrettable. But thirdly, why do people have lesser capacity to be able to make decisions in this? Why this in the question on people is important, because when we have conversations about democratic politics, we want to uphold democracy, and democracy comes from people. What is the best upholding of democracy, and how do we best achieve it in our world? We best achieve it in our world because on principle, democracy is about the
POI.
capacity for individuals to be able to make choices and have discourse about issues. And one of the main systems by which people can have that discourse and make those choices is being presented with options. Don't worry, I'll take you. Just give me time to wrap this up, right? One of the mechanisms by which individuals are able to make those choices is by them having options and them being able to create their system by being able to vote out systems they don't want. That's why even when people, for example, do not vote for a dynasty leader or dynasty rule, it's unlikely that a dynasty candidate is going to come up anytime soon because the people have filtered that out from their system. And even in instances where they do, they have deeper conversations about it because it's similar to something that they already took down. We think this is valuable within the context of a democratic system. I'll take that POI from opening.
Okay, so aside from the fact that your team did not have any unique contribution to the debate, how do you interact with the context of power that OG presents to you in the sense that they lack the incentive to even lobby for their policies to be passed because their parliament members have proliferated the political space, the Congress and all parliaments? We don't think you engage much on that.
All right. You're now asking for, give me 30-second POI. Let's start with our unique contribution, which of course it makes sense that OG didn't, right? Our unique contribution is very simple. We think that in a lot of democratic politics, the individuals that need or actually rely on the clutch that is, for example, legacy power or some form of dynasty power are individuals from minority spaces. Why is this true? Because in a lot of democratic systems, individuals do not view politics as a means of power or any other structures of them being in power that you also allude to. For example, individuals come from financial dynasties that have nothing to do with politics. Individuals come from social dynasties, educational dynasties, and all these things that do give them leverage. Politics is not the main means or the main clutch that people use most of the times in democratic politics to gain power. But individuals that deeply need it are individuals in the minority space. Why? Because, for example, there is no historical precedence of individuals being in power. So, for example, the very fact that we've had Obama in power is highly likely that anyone who runs from the lineage of Obama who is black is likely to be a president. This is an advantage for them because for the vast majority of existence, a lot of black people struggle to run into power. That's why they also need his endorsement when they do run. And that's why they also need that mentioning. That's where dynasty power becomes very valuable in terms of its contribution to helping people in who wouldn't have otherwise got into spaces. That's also the reason why Hillary Clinton was considered in the first place, especially in the political space that wouldn't listen to a woman. And the fact that we're able to at least have this penetration for spaces that are inherently exclusionary is something valuable to the political discourse, particularly with us having shown to you that it doesn't take away from people's capacity to still make a choice as voters, or it doesn't disrupt the system in a way that hinders the internal structures of the parties and hinders the internal structure of democracy. But also, lastly, in conclusion, as to why the power that they talk about, from OG, the power that they talk about from OG, which was heavily unmechanized, but let's just assume it was, right? The power that they talk about from OG is the idea that these individuals amass some form of great power that enables them to be able to then proliferate and influence the system. Firstly, we tell you that that's still unlikely because the internal structures of voting still exist. They still need to be accountable to the people. There's still checks and balances within the systems. Discourse still happens and they still need accountability. And two, we think that in democratic politics, these are still the most unfavorable systems, so they don't have an overwhelming advantage. Proudly closing.
All right, and we thank the opposition whip for that speech, and that brings a close to the Masters Round debate. Thank you guys so much for such an interesting conversation and interesting chats. I'm going to hand over to someone from OrgCom to kind of handle the dissolution of this, and the panels will then obviously go on to deliberate. Good luck to the judges for their judge test.
Oh yeah, I confirm that I'm clearly audible.
Yep, you're audible.